You are listening to ESG News and Views from the Conference Board.
Hello and welcome to ESG News and Views. I'm really delighted to be joined by Bob Zukis, who's CEO and founder of Digital Directors Network and an adjunct professor of management and organization at the USC Marshall School of Business. He's one of the world's leading experts on digital and cybersecurity risk, and he's also a Center Fellow here at the Conference Board. Bob is co-author of the book, The Great Reboot, Succeeding in a World of Catastrophic Risk and Opportunity, which was published in 2020. I thought the book was absolutely terrific. It is one of those rare books that made me look at the world in a brand new way. It gave me an entirely new understanding of the term systemic risk, which is a term that's used an awful lot these days. And it made me understand that there are practical steps that companies and others can take in addressing systemic risk, but that we all need to think about new ways to do so. So I'm really, really excited to dive into this topic with Bob. So welcome to ESG's News and Views, Bob.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be here.
Great. So Bob, can you talk a little bit about what the book is about?
Yeah, when we talk about systemic risk, Paul, it's really, one way to look at that, it's really about Frankenstein risk. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to use the learning moment of COVID and the systemic failure we were all living through to really help executives reframe how they understand risk in their complex digital business system throughout their business. And also coming out of the back of the pandemic, how they can look at the system of the business and capitalize on systemic change, which usually follows systemic failure. So it's very much a blueprint for leaders to use for strategic planning, as well as to understand the complex world that we live within.
Yeah, and was it the pandemic that prompted you to write this book, or what brought this about? Because, you've been laboring in the fields of digital and cyber risk for a while. What prompted you to write it now?
Yeah, no doubt lockdown was a good excuse to get focused and knock out a book, which we started on February 28th and we published on June 1st. But we've been talking about these issues in the marketplace for the last several years, and we've actually been teaching executives how to become systems thinkers and how to understand these concepts, principles, and apply them, in a contextual way to their digital business system. But with COVID, we had some time, and we also had the storyline that we all can relate to because we were all feeling the substantial pain of systemic risk and failure that was right in front of our eyes, and that was evolving daily.
Right. It was an ongoing lesson in systemic risk in a way. So tell me, what did the pandemic reveal about systemic risk? And maybe even before you get into that, do you want to talk a little bit about your view and how you define systemic risk? Because I think it's really, for me, it was really interesting and eye-opening. There's more to it than just the failure of an overall system. You get into what is a complex system and how can complex systems fail. So maybe give a little background on systemic risk, how you see it, and then what lessons the pandemic revealed about systemic risk.
Yeah, it goes back to that Frankenstein metaphor when you look at systemic risk. Most IT environments are not unlike Frankenstein's monster. They're this cobbled together collection of parts. And the lesson of Frankenstein's monster is one bad part, one bad critical part, a bad brain can jeopardize, the purpose of the entire system. So when we look at systemic risk, we look at, the component risk. Conventional risk management tends to focus on the component, on the parts of the system. It doesn't really focus on how that part impacts the larger system or how that part impacts other parts that are part of a complex system. Systemic risk is really the next generation, the next level of enterprise risk management. And, we live in a world of complex systems, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. They're all around us. The human body's a complex system. The natural world's a complex system. We have mechanical systems all around us that are complex, from the automobile to the aerospace industry. In the context of the boardroom and in the context of the digital business system, we haven't really thought of those systems necessarily along the same lines as we do other complex systems. So we're really introducing those concepts and those principles to the leadership level so that they can understand risk really at a different level and risk throughout their business that's coming from the digital business system. The lesson through the pandemic is really a lesson that we see every time there's large scale systemic failure. When leaders don't understand systemic risk, they have two options when the system starts to fail. They can ignore the risk and just let the system fail and melt down, or they can shut the system down. In the context of the pandemic, we did both approaches here in the United States. And we had a horrible outcome as a result. So when leaders do understand systemic risk, the third option is to actually mitigate the risk and take proactive steps to understand that risk and to mitigate its impacts, which tend to be catastrophic. That's what's different with systemic risk and conventional risk management. The impacts are much, much, much more severe and much less predictable.
Right. And I think we may get into this later too, but I think the natural inclination sometimes for boards and for senior management is to be told, oh, well, this risk has a really low likelihood of occurring. It could have terrible results if it did occur, but it's low likelihood. Okay, so nothing to see here, folks. Let's move on.
Yeah. But
I think that the pandemic revealed that, and other circumstances revealed that that's a dangerous thing to do, right? We saw it in the financial crisis. We saw it, as you pointed out in your book, with the Challenger disaster. It was an O-ring that failed, that brought down the space shuttle. So it's this one component that can have this cascading impact, and you need to be prepared to address that. And I think one thing that you said in your book I thought was really interesting was that one of the things that was revealed by the pandemic experience was just the weakness of our healthcare system in the US. And it was frankly people trying to protect the healthcare system that caused us to go into overall shutdown mode. I don't want to know if you want to talk a little bit more about that, but I think it's in that case, it struck me as interesting that healthcare itself is a Frankenstein system.
Yeah.
But it is only a component of a much broader economic and social system that we're all living in. And that weakness in that component had a devastating impact.
Yeah, and that's, the conventional risk taught leaders how to understand component risk, right? What's the risk of something failing? What's the probability times the impact? And if that multiple was low, you would tend to dismiss that risk. You wouldn't consider that risk against the larger system. Systemic risk, you don't have that luxury because a lot of systemic failures start with what seem like relatively simple failure points in terms of the pandemic. And, with this latest wave of the pandemic, we're running up against a significant constraint in the healthcare system. And that's just the number of people that we can put into critical care type of situations with the limitation of only around 100,000 ICU beds across the United States. So if you cap out your ability to care for people, you run the risk of the entire healthcare system melting down. And, as we went through, the first wave of this, people had to react to that. We didn't know a lot about the virus. The death rates were 5-6%. So we would have maxed out on our healthcare capacity very, very quickly. So, the option to some people was let's lock down. The option to some other people was let's ignore it and take our chances. We see what that outcome has been now. But you need to understand those component parts, regardless of how trivial and how they impact the larger system, to really understand this stuff at the level that it needs to be understood.
And what do you? You talked a little bit about the responses of either sort of ignoring it or shutting the system down. In hindsight, what should we have done differently or better?
Well, it's interesting. We actually understood the risks within the complex system of our healthcare system very, very well. There were people that had modeled that and understood it. There was plenty of analysis that was published and well documented that recognized you have to start to deal with some of these critical constraints in the system. You have to deal with the fact that you've got a finite ability for around ICU beds. You have to educate the public differently. So there was a very functional roadmap in place that could have mitigated the impact of this. The problem was at a leadership level, we didn't understand it and we didn't apply it. And, we kind of just let, things, go down an uncontrolled, unled path. And, it's where we're at today, right now. But, that's kind of the lesson in here is, the world's not going to get any less complex for one simple reason, because we need it to be complex, because it needs to solve, the problems and serve the needs of, almost 8 billion people on the planet. So we don't have an option but to understand systemic risk differently and be more effective at mitigating its consequences. And the good news is we have that ability. Each one of these systemic failures, these catastrophic systemic failures, even COVID, there were people that had modeled it, that understood the systemic risk in the system. It's within our capacity to understand systemic risk. Doing something about it is where the weakness comes in, and that's usually a weakness at the leadership level.
Yeah, but it may also, as you point out, be an understanding at the leadership level, right? Because it can take time to get to understand these Frankenstein systems that we've built, whether it's in healthcare or in cyber, right? And how we manage data. I mean, those are sometimes difficult, sometimes technical, areas for leaders to understand. But I think what you're saying is people at the top have to invest the time in actually understanding those systems and have people who can explain them to them too, right? So that the people who are responsible for making the decisions have a full awareness of the risks that can stem from these Frankenstein systems.
Yeah, exactly. And, the good news is this stuff can be taught, this stuff can be learned, and we can get much, much better at this. So the ROI on understanding these issues is incredible. And, we can't afford to ignore systemic risk really at the planetary level, at the human health level across these digital business systems, because these type of catastrophes are crippling.
Yeah. So let's talk about risk in some other areas. And let me talk about with you, because you're such an expert in the area, about systemic risk in, call it the digital space. That's not a great term, but you've got technology very broadly, digital more narrowly, and then cyber a little more narrowly compared to that. But risk there is even a little more challenging, right, than in the area of the pandemic, because there in the area of cyber, you actually have people trying to take the system down. So it's even a more acute challenge, I think, in some ways.
Yeah, you've got an active risk environment, and and cyber is just one part of a digital business system. It's one critical part that keeps the entire system functioning to fulfill whatever business purpose it was designed to fulfill. But we've had success with a framework that we've created. It's called the Director Framework. 8 letters, 8 domains of the complex digital business system that range from data to the architecture to cybersecurity to emerging tech to the regulatory framework and to the IT operations framework and the third-party risks that encompass the digital business system. So once we reframe the digital business system, around the critical domains that have to work together to fulfill whatever business purpose the system is designed to support or to drive, directors and non-technology executives get this stuff. They get it very, very quickly. That's something else that I'm very encouraged with, because we understand business, we understand the breadth of business, the scope of business. We've been steeped and trained as process thinkers, but thinking as a systems thinker is different than a process thinker, but they're close cousins. So this is within the reach of most executives. They just have to get focused on it and have the right guidance and development around it, but they can get there very quickly.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you're talking about the digital business systems. And I think one thing that comes through in your book is that this is important for everyone now. I mean, many of us are working remotely or we're having packages shipped to us remotely. But, to the extent that there was the digital transformation of businesses underway, that's only accelerated as a result of the pandemic, right?
Yeah, and this stuff isn't going to go away, right? So as the digital stakes, increase, the digital risks increase, and I think the World Economic Forum data was 60% of global GDP is running off of a digital backbone through digital means. So, as business value increasingly gets dependent upon these issues, we have no choice but to be forced to understand the risks to that business value, or if you don't, you suffer the consequences.
Right. Let's talk about this hack. What needs to happen a little practically at the board level? Because the digital stakes are higher, the digital risks are higher, but it can still happen sometimes that if you talk to a board about cybersecurity, their eyes might glaze over a little bit, or they might think, okay, this is somebody that there's a specialist who deals with this, or isn't there a committee that deals with this? So how do you get people, and maybe it's through your framework, but what do boards need to do a little differently when they're thinking about their digital business systems risk?
Yeah, there's really three parts to that solution. It's the skills and the capability in the boardroom to understand these issues. It's the structure of the board. How is the board organized around these issues? And then it's the scope of risk oversight. And that's where we talk about adopting a systemic risk mindset and applying that at a management level. In the press today, SolarWinds and the breach, the Russian hack of the federal government. SolarWinds product was in the White House and several other critical agencies. If you look at SolarWinds, they disclose that they have cybersecurity experience and skill sets on their board. Interestingly, they task their nominating and governance committee with cybersecurity risk oversight. And if you look at their risk factor disclosures, they talk about the system. They talk about the criticality of the system, and they've called out, the threat of nation states, foreign governments, how aggressive that threat surfaces to their business model. So they've done a pretty decent job. I wouldn't give them an A+ in how they've approached it, but they've done more than most companies have at the board level to address these issues. And you would hope that they would, because this is the business that they're in. But they still even have other things that they could and should be doing to really be a leading light from a governance perspective around the digital and cybersecurity system that drives their business.
Yeah, let me ask you a little bit more about that, not with SolarWinds in particular, but what do you think are best practices when it comes to the skills and structure of a board in overseeing, call it digital business systems risk and opportunities? How much do you need in terms of people who have labored in the field as chief information security officers, or how much can you do by educating your general board members so that everyone's up to speed? And if you put this topic with your nominating governance committee, sometimes they have a tendency to look at it more in terms of reputation risk, or, do we have the right processes in place, rather than maybe delve as deeply into substance. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on how does a board up its skill level in this area, and what are your thoughts? I know one size doesn't fit all, but what are your thoughts in terms of the structure?
Yeah, the good news, again, there are some leading practices that are emerging, companies like Walmart, FedEx. The leading practices are, again, around skills, board structure, and then their approach to systemic risk oversight is kind of that next generation of enterprise risk management. Those leading practices really revolve around the concept of having a critical mass of digital and cybersecurity skills on the boardroom. Critical mass tends to be 3 directors who understand and have a breadth of skills and competencies across the digital business system. And we use the director framework, again, as a bit of a competency model. So, if you're a data scientist, if you understand architecture, emerging technologies, cybersecurity, one of those 8 domains, a lot of CIOs, CISOs, technology executives are steeped in multiple domains. But, these aren't specialists. You hear that a lot. CIOs and CISOs, we don't need another specialist in the boardroom. These are business executives who understand how information technologies create value and how they can protect and how they need to protect that value. So skills and capabilities, a critical mass of 3 is a leading practice. A tech and cyber committee dedicated to these issues. That's one of the shortcomings of SolarWinds. They talk about risk, but risk seems to be addressed in the abstract at the governance level. It's not really connected with value. You can't have an emerging technology discussion without understanding the risks that emerging technology brings to the organization. You can't have a discussion. You have to have those discussions concurrently. So we love tech and cyber committees, Walmart, FedEx. Why does Walmart get it? Well, they have to because of the competitive threat of Amazon. So they felt it was important enough at the senior leadership level, the boardroom of the organization, to have a structured approach and dedicated folks dealing with this issue. And then it's really, do they understand systemic risk, and then are they really mitigating risk at that level, or are they still stuck in a conventional risk mindset? But those are the 3 legs of the stool and leading practices for any board that we're strong advocates and supporters of.
That's really helpful practical advice. It also seems, though, that someone actually has to understand what the Frankenstein monster actually looks like, maybe even straighten it out a bit. Like if your digital business systems have been built over time and cobbled together, might be beyond the board, but certainly management has to understand, and not just the management who sits in the CIO or CISO seat, but really your CEO, your general counsel, your CFO, your other folks really have to have an understanding of how digital technology intersects with your business. What are the platforms that you're using? How do they function?
Yeah, and that's an important part of mitigating systemic risk, is simplifying the system. So the things that contribute to a high level of systemic risk, it's really the replaceability of the component parts. It's how interconnected they are. It's the size of the system. It's the complexity of the system, how homogeneous or heterogeneous it is. And then it's all the jurisdictions you have to deal with. So when you talk about simplicity, and most of these digital environments, they've been built up over 20, 30 years, right? So you literally have this shanty town that continues to build and grow. And unless you kind of step back and exercise a simplicity exercise where you rationalize the applications and the platforms that you're running on, you're really just exacerbating the systemic problem. You really have to manage, systemic complexity throughout the system over time, because it'll just inherently creep in.
Yeah,
it's just the nature of complex systems.
No, that makes sense. And you contrast it a little bit to the governmental side. I mean, we're all learning an awful lot about election law and how a presidential election actually unfolds these days, right? But if there's an advantage there, is that to a large extent, the system was conceived in a few stages, right? At the founding of this country, then there was some legislation in the late 19th century. But in fact, there were people who looked at the system overall a couple times and built it with some coherence. Now, obviously, things have been added to it over time, but at least there's an underlying framework that was built at one point, and then some substantial revision. What you're often dealing with technology is it could be a long time since someone even ever really said, okay, what does this system overall look like for us? Where does our business intersect, or do our businesses intersect with technology, and what does that platform look like? So there's a lot of work to be done to actually understand it, and then to the extent possible to simplify it, and I think also to make sure that there's redundancy, right?
Yeah, it goes back to concepts of master planning, right? So is there a master plan design architecture in place that really is built to address, this foundational risk issue? And, in most organizations, in technology, IT, the digital, there's so many new tools that are just coming online as they have been over the last 20, 30 years. It was difficult to kind of put and envision, a structural master plan that, accommodated all these developments and the implications of these developments. But That's not impossible. And again, it is possible if you understand systemic risk and you think as a systemic thinker. You do bake in a lot of foundational concepts into the system. We see this in aerospace and defense, nuclear energy. There are mechanical concepts in systems engineering and in systems management that people that build complex mechanical systems adopt and apply. We just need to adopt and apply them at a different level and in a different domain here in the boardroom, and certainly in regard to the digital business system. But we can get there. We don't have a choice.
Yeah, and I think there's a parallel here too with what's happening with the way boards are also starting to grapple with workforce issues. Obviously, the pandemic, social unrest, and so forth of 2020 has really focused a lot of boards on their workforce. And so what companies are coming to terms with is, okay, you've got your business strategy, but what actually enables your business strategy? Well, it's your people. So you really ought to have a human capital strategy, which means you have to understand your workforce. You have to understand what makes it run. You have to have an overall strategy for your workforce. And similarly, what makes your business strategy, implemented? It's your digital technologies, right? So you actually need to have, it seems to me, right, an overall understanding of it, and then a strategy for carrying it out. And that strategy has to involve an assessment of the risks. So I think there's a sense in which boards can't leave a discussion of business strategy and say, okay, are we in the right businesses? How are we performing competitively? They really need to drill down and say, all right, do we have the people to carry it out? Do we have the technology to carry it out? And what are the risks that we're facing with respect to our people and with respect to our technology? It's a deeper dive into the implementation of strategy, and not just sort of brushing your hands together and saying, hey, we're done. We had our strategy discussion. Let's move on.
Yeah, governance is inherently systemic, I think, is what you just said. So, certainly in regard to the digital business system, but then more broadly, across all the different stakeholders that boardrooms are tasked with governing across the totality of a business. It's inherently a systemic undertaking, and I don't think we viewed it as such typically. And complex systems science is an emerging field of study and practice. The World Economic Forum has called out systems thinking skills as critical skills that every company needs post-pandemic, and every leader needs post-pandemic. And, it's systemic risk and failure. And, the good news is when you go through these experiences, you have the opportunity for systemic change. So you have the opportunity, you wake up to the systemic issues, the systemic failures, and you see opportunities to change things. And that means market shifts, market shocks, permanent changes in the world around us. And systemic change, to me, is business opportunity and the opportunity risk that corporate directors need to also be engaged in and lead that conversation around strategically.
Right. No, and I think what your book does really powerfully is it gets people to think in terms of systems and the way those systems interrelate. And you're entirely right that governance itself is a system that then relates to all of these others within a company, right? So, Bob, you just mentioned opportunities. So can you talk a little bit about how systemic thinking can help boards and management actually take advantage of opportunities and not just avoid risks?
Yeah, and that was kind of a core storyline in the book. We wanted to clearly focus folks on systemic risk and the failure that we were all living through, and the failures that we've seen before from a systemic perspective. But we really wanted to tell the next chapter of the story too. So systemic change. So when you have systemic failure and this level of systemic risk that turns into failure, it leads to opportunity risk and strategic opportunities. So the system starts to change, and large scale change. Systems changes or large scale changes, a chance to reboot, entire systems. And, that's an opportunity in and of itself. And that's also a threat in and of itself for companies as markets shift. We're seeing a situation where we've had some shocks to some markets. environments, maybe they're temporary, maybe they're not. Will they be shifts? And, when your markets shift, that's both an opportunity and a risk for business leaders as well. So systemic risk leads to systemic failure. And, the silver lining is you see systemic change on the back end if you understand it and can capitalize on it.
Right. And so one of the lessons you should take with you is, as you're planning to deal with that systemic change and take advantage of those opportunities, try to simplify some of your systems to do so. Don't just glom something onto what you were doing, but actually do a bit of a redesign, a real fresh reboot. So let me ask you, you spend a lot of time with senior executives and directors. If you have one piece of advice for CEOs right now, what would it be?
Yeah, it's really the systemic change conversations. It's the opportunity risk that they have to really drive substantial growth on the back of everything that we're experiencing right here. I think it's an incredible business growth opportunity. And, the good news is the same skills and competencies you need to have as a systems thinker to understand systemic risk and systemic failure apply to systemic change, but you have to focus them differently, and it's really around the opportunity risks and the strategic risks. So don't get bogged down in the catastrophe of what we're all experiencing, but recognize the substantial upside that comes with systemic change on the back end of this,
which really involves looking at things through the sort of systemic lens, I think. And that can give you that opportunity to take advantage of those opportunities out there. Well, look, this has been a really interesting conversation, Bob. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you all for listening. The Great Reboot is available on Amazon, and you can find a link to it on this podcast's webpage. And you can also find additional podcasts, webcasts, and online postings on all things relating to corporate governance, sustainability, and corporate citizenship by visiting ESG News and Views at conference-board.org/blog/podcasts. Thank you all for listening, and thanks again, Bob.
Thank you, Paul.
This has been Off the Shelf, a podcast by the Conference Board.